Our village is on the bank of the Nile, in Nubia, at a couple of day journey from Aswan. 200 people used to live here, but today the village is empty. I often used to sit on this mastaba outside my house with Yusuf, Mustafa and the others. Now they are all gone. I am the only one left. When the government official came down here and the village chief, the Omda, told us that the whole village was going to be submerged, we all laughed. But the high dam, the Sad al-Ali, was being built. The water began to rise higher and higher. A boat arrived to take us away. You must leave the village, the Omda said. The government has houses and work for you in Komombo. The men grumbled and the women wept, but they left. Only I stayed behind. I want to go to the south where my father grew up. I shall find work there. The rise of the boat to the south says so, and Azam. The Georgian says so too. He says not only the houses, the village, the palm trees and the fields will be submerged, but also the graves and the sacred temples. When the dam is completed, everything that is not taken away will be covered by a vast lake as far as the eye can see. The rise says, I must not be downhearted. We shall be no danger, and the houses and many of the temples will be saved.
For centuries, the rock-hewn temples of Abu Simbel lay buried in the sand of the Nubian desert. The great temple that had passed entirely into oblivion was only discovered again in the year 1813 by the Swiss Orientalist Johann Ludwig Burckhardt. The temples are situated right on the bank of the Nile, not far from the Sudanese frontier. The smaller one is dedicated to the goddess Hathor. 6 striding figures surround the portal, all of them portraying the Pharaoh Ramesses II and his wife Nefertari. The walls and ceilings in the temple are adorned with colored reliefs. The royal couple, portrayed in the bloom of their youth, offer the gods sacrifices of flowers and gifts. The famous pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, one of the last in Egypt's long golden age, had the temples built around the year 1260 before Christ. Ramesses is portrayed 4 times in front of the great temple. Each of these colossal figures is more than 22 meters high. The members of the royal family are dwarfed by the giant statues. The head of one of them fell to the ground, probably at the time of the Egyptian dynasties. Over the relief of the sun god Re on the cornice of the pylon, baboons greet the rising sun. The reliefs on the outside walls show us something of the life of man 3,000 years ago. 2 deities of the Nile unite the lily and the papyrus to symbolize the union of the kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt. Apart from the figures of Ramesses' wife Nefertari and his favorite children, the temple facade has symbolic statues representing the monarch's greatness and the respect he commands among his enemies. The inscriptions tell of the exploits of his reign. Long rows of fettered prisoners on either side of the entrance signify his successful military campaigns. For almost 3,000 years, the strange wonder of the sun has taken place in the great temple of Abu Simbel every year in March and September. It's a supreme example of the knowledge of astronomy which the ancient Egyptians possessed and of the great skill of their architects. Through the narrow entrance to the temple and through the giant pillared hall, the sun's rays penetrate over 70 meters deep into the inner sanctuary. To illuminate the images of the gods Ammon and Reharakti and of Pharaoh himself. Only Ptah, the great god of Memphis, god of the underworld, remains in the shadows. The figures in the pillared hall, each of them 8 meters high, also portray Ramesses II in the guise of the god Osiris. Colored reliefs on the walls glorify his deeds. As supreme warlord, Pharaoh conquered the Hittites in Syria in the year 1285 before Christ, after they had invaded his realm. All portrayals of the great Pharaoh's power and glory bear witness to the incomparable artistic skill of his time. After overthrowing his enemies, Ramesses appears on other reliefs as the wise ruler, receiving the thanks of his subjects, issuing decrees, and paying due tribute to the gods to whom he dedicated this temple by sacrifice and veneration. Nearly all the reliefs show the figure of the king enthroned between the gods, whose equal he is. The sacred bark is ready at all times to carry him across the Nile to the gods. Today, more than 3,000 years afterwards, the descendants of Pharaoh are confronted with problems which he would have found difficult to understand. The area in which this rapidly growing people can live and grow their food is limited to the narrow strip of fertile land on either bank of the Nile. Egypt's famous granary has now become too small. By the construction of the Aswan Dam, the Egyptians want to obtain new areas of cultivation. By damming the waters of the Nile, an enormous reservoir will be created. In future, it will be possible for more land to be irrigated, for agricultural production to be increased, and for electric power to be generated for the build-up of the country's own industry. But the building of the dam also creates problems. Towns and villages threatened by the water must be evacuated, and thousands of people have to be resettled. Irreplaceable monuments of the golden age of Nubia will be submerged in the rising waters of the Nile unless something is done at the last moment to save them. The threat to the rock-hewn temples of Abu Simbel alarms the whole of the civilized world. Appeals from the UNESCO result in the creation of a unique aid scheme. The race against the rising waters and against time begins. Many ways of rescuing the temples were suggested. The plan ultimately agreed upon is this: construction of a cofferdam to protect the temples from flooding while dismantling is taking place. The facade to be banked up with sand to protect the statues of Ramesses. Shoring the interior of the temple with steel scaffolding. Removal of the rock surrounding the temple until a wall thickness of 80 centimeters is reached. Dismantling the temples in blocks of 10 and 30 tons and removal to a safe storage area well clear of the high water mark. Reassembly of the temples on a site 65 meters higher up than the original location. Erection of a reinforced concrete shell to support the rock load which the roof of the temple can no longer withstand. In November 1963, the joint venture Abu Simbel, an international group of building contractors with the HORST company acting as the principal spokesman, received the contract for the removal of the temples. The engineers were the first to appear on the scene, and at that time Abu Simbel gave them a realistic idea of the working conditions that must have prevailed in Ramesses' times, for since then very little has changed in the Nubian desert. Aswan, the nearest town, is 280 kilometers downstream. There are no roads along which building materials, machines and food supplies can be transported. Consignments from Europe take 5 months to get here. Even from Cairo, delivery takes a month or two. Yet there must be no delay. An old riverboat is used as a kind of headquarters. Engineers, technicians and workers live in huts and tents. Even before proper living quarters can be provided, work must start on the construction of the cofferdam. First of all, a steel piling wall is erected. The crest of the cofferdam must ultimately be 25 meters above the riverbed. To the north of the small temple, the piling wall is to be linked to the rock face, and from there it will extend as far as the southern tip of the great temple. The rock material for banking up the dam is obtained from a stone quarry about a kilometer away from the construction site and is transported by rock tippers. At the end of 1964, a crucial race begins between the building of the dam and the rising waters of the Nile. Day and night, the rock tippers rumble up to the site to unload their material. Before work can start on removing the rock over the temple, the statues and faces have to be covered with fine sand as a protection against falling stones. At the more sensitive spots, the sand is applied manually. Excavation work with special machines starts from the top on the rock plateau that has been prepared there. A guard over the facade prevents large fragments of rock from damaging the layer of sand. The rock material removed from above the temples is used for the construction of the dam. End of February 1965. The bulkhead is completed and the temple facade has once again disappeared in the sand where it was prior to its discovery. The inside can now only be reached through a steel pipe. The interior of the two temples have to be shored. For this, strong steel sections are used. In order not to damage the ornamentation on the walls and ceilings, the steel supports are padded with felt mats and plastic foil. All the steel supports are numbered so that they can be used in the same sequence when the temples are reassembled. The compressors are ready. The removal of the rock immediately above the temples can start. Using stone sawing strands, giant blocks are cut out. Jib saws are brought into use. For the men at the saws, this is only a kind of dress rehearsal. So long as they're only tackling the wall of rock round the temple, no real precision is yet required, and they can work with broader cuts. At the sides, the rock is broken off piece by piece. Pneumatic drills can only be used on the outer sections. The vibrations they cause are constantly measured inside the temple. More and more of the rock material over the temples is removed. Now only 2 cavities in the massive rock face show where the temples are. 2 derricks are already waiting to take away the sawn-out blocks. Working in this heat and dust is very hard, but they're already getting closer to the temple walls. The wall surrounding the great temple is now reached. This is where the most difficult part of the job begins. The finest cuts on the surfaces can only be made by hand. The rock is so brittle that contact with water would cause it to crumble, so no water must be used when sawing. The cuts through the temple's ceiling must be made with mathematical precision. The ceiling of the temple is cut away block by block. In the cavities that are left, the shoring structure becomes visible. The cut-out blocks are transported to the storage area. For safe transport, these gigantic blocks must be held firmly in position. The drill holes, which take the anchor trusses, are filled with synthetic resin and sand. When it sets, it ensures the necessary adhesion, so that the load can withstand any possible strain. There are more than 1,000 temple blocks and about 7,000 from the rock framework round the temple. Each of them must be so marked that it can be found later without any long time-wasting search. The mighty heads of the Ramesses Colossus protrude out of the sand. In sawing out the heads of the pharaoh statues, only very few cuts could be made. The faces remain intact. Foil is used to prevent the cutting surfaces from crumbling. When cutting out the faces, work had to continue day and night without a break. Any interruption in the cutting might have caused the soft rock interspersed with hard seams to crumble, owing to the change in tension. And this is the moment that journalists and press photographers have waited for all night. Ramesses loses his face. Last majestic look at the bare facade before the special low-load transport vehicle carries him to the storage area. The two storage sites are located on a plateau near the spot where the temples are to be re-erected. The position and number of each block are registered just like books in a library. From the storage area, the great pharaoh can see the round roofs of the houses, which have meanwhile been built for 1,000 local workers. Perhaps he even casts a longing look at the swimming pool, the waters of which must seem like a mirage in the desert. In the meantime, the water has risen above the base of the original site, but the coffer dam has stood the test. Ramesses is out of danger. As the days pass, the hand sawing of the blocks and their removal to the storage site proceeds more and more smoothly. Each block is transported without jolting and standing in its original upright position. This ensures that it will not break as a result of a sudden change in stress. And so the work advances farther and farther into the interior of the temple. And every day, new works of Egyptian art are brought into the bright daylight for the first time. The godlike pharaoh seems somewhat fearful as he looks out on this new technological age, an age which saves him from crumbling with the help of synthetic resin injections. The supporting pillars are dismantled by means of very fine cuts. Here, the experts work with extreme care because these exposed surfaces are particularly brittle. The Nile continues to rise. But even if it were to overflow the coffer dam, the most it could do would be to cover the stumps of Pharaoh's legs. The last of the wall reliefs is ready to be carried away. It's only a coincidence, of course, but it bears the motto under which the dismantling of the temples is being carried out: union of the upper and lower Nile as the symbol of wealth and fertility. Whilst the dismantling work is taking place under cover of the coffer dam, preparations begin on the plateau for the re-erection. When the axis has been exactly calculated to ensure the resumption of the same biannual miracle of sunlight, the reconstruction of the interior of the temple commences, using the same steel shoring sections employed during dismantling. Exactly in accordance with plan and number, the blocks are transported to their rightful places. Thanks to the precision in dismantling the temples, the gigantic blocks fit together perfectly. The construction site on the bank of the Nile is deserted. The bulkhead is submerged. Up on the plateau, the temples awaken to new life. The famous facade of Abu Simbel assumes its former shape again. The completion of reassembly, however, doesn't mean the job is now finished. The rocky landscape around Abu Simbel has to be restored to its original state, and this means that 12,000 square meters of desert have to be re-landscaped. To support the artificial rock filling that is to cover the temples, gigantic concrete domes have to be erected. One of these domes, with a span of 60 meters, forms an arch over the great temple. In order to avoid uncontrollable tensions, the arch is divided into individual segments. Later, these segments will have to support a weight of more than 20 tons of earth and rock per square meter. At the small temples, the erection of the blocks for the rock surround commences. The external surrounding wall is already being built. On the great temple, some restoration work is necessary. Its facade is made crack and weather resistant. After all, it has to survive further thousands of years. Once the joints have been sealed, it'll be impossible to see that the temples had once been cut up into separate blocks. After removing the protective foil, the joints are treated with a paste of sand and cement, which is blended to conform to the color of the surrounding stone. The protective foil is carefully softened so that the brittle surface of the stone doesn't adhere to it when it is drawn off. Here, archaeologists keep a watchful eye on every operation to ensure that the stone doesn't absorb too much moisture, which might cause discoloration of the surface. In the temple, restoration work is now in full swing. The statue of the god Amun in the sanctuary is cleaned. Synthetic resin is applied to the stone to protect it against further decay. A view of the archaeologist's workshop. Using stone that has been ground to powder by hand, different colored pastes are mixed so that in the sealing of the joints and in the restoration work, the exact shade of the original color of the stone can be matched. All this embellishment work takes months. On completion of the restoration, the last of the steel supporting sections are removed from the temple. The area surrounding the temples reverts once again to the original rocky landscape of Abu Simbel. About 7,000 blocks of stone from the massif, out of which the temples were hewn, are piled up to form a solid rock face. Here again, great care is needed. Every single gap must be filled in order to restore the previous natural appearance. The link up to the great temple is completed. The last of the blocks are inserted on the facades of the small and large temples. December 1967. The spherical domes are approaching completion. Not only is the removal of the temples an entirely new technological venture for the engineers and surveyors, but also the construction of this concrete shell. Never before had domes of such tremendous dimensions been built to take such great stresses. The necessary static calculations represented one of the most comprehensive computer programs ever required for a building project. While the building work is going on, the theoretically calculated figures are constantly compared with the actual construction. Tension, expansion and deformation of the domes, which have to support an enormous weight, are subjected to constant checks. Sand and boulders are tipped over the domes. This final landscaping reminds one of the very start of the operations at Abu Simbel. Where the work of the machines is too rough, the banking up is done by hand. Here at last, water can be used, which during the salvage work had so often to be avoided. It almost seems to symbolize the fact that the threat to the temples of Abu Simbel is now a thing of the past. The work of reassembling the temples is completed 18 months sooner than expected. The godlike Pharaoh again sits enthroned high over the waters of the Nile, in which he would have been submerged had it not been for the aid of our modern world of technology. The rock-hewn temples of Abu Simbel are more than just a testimony to an ancient civilization. Their salvation by the UNESCO represents the united efforts by the nations of the world to cultivate and preserve the cultural heritage of mankind.